Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm John Ruggie, Director of the Mosava Rahmani Center for Business and Government, and welcome to the kickoff event of our 25th anniversary as a center at the Kennedy School. When we opened our doors back in 1982, Ronald Reagan was in the second year of his presidency. The first CD player was sold in Japan that year. The stock market hit a high of 1,070. And an antitrust suit broke up the famous telephone system in the United States, creating the Baby Bells, the regional phone companies, which are no longer regional. Here at Harvard, Winthrop Knowlton became the first director of the center. He had an enormous research agenda then, as we do today. And it included some of the same issues that we will be addressing at our conference tomorrow and our speaker will be addressing here tonight, including ways of restoring and keeping sustained growth in the American economy, regulatory reform, healthcare issues, improving the impact of public policy to incentivize businesses to do the right thing, and so forth. Today, our work touches very much on the same sets of issues, and our agenda has become thoroughly global in focus. Our research and training program today takes place on every continent. We engage with governments and businesses literally around the world and continue to focus on the intersection of the private and public sector, trying to get the balance right. 2 years ago, we were honored by a generous gift by Bijan and Sharmin Mosavar Rahmani, hence the name of our center. They're here tonight. Thank you both, and thank you for coming tonight. And your vision and your generosity has made it possible for us to have many more anniversary parties. One logistical note, those of you who are registered for our conference, there will be buses at the top of the driveway taking you to the next event tonight, right after the forum. So the thematic focus of our celebration for this 25th anniversary is new directions in regulatory policy. I now ask our Dean, David Elwood, to introduce our speaker, David Mcclellan, who has walked the walk of regulatory reform. Dean Elwood.
Thank you very much, John, and welcome. I am David Elwood, the Dean of the Kennedy School here, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. I do have one request, which I didn't used to have to give, but turn off your cell phones. That's one place where regulations still need some work to do. We ought to be able to jam those babies or something. In any case, I'm very excited to be introducing tonight's speaker, and I'm actually particularly excited to be here as part of the celebration of the anniversary of the Center of Business and Government. Many of you know one of my primary focuses as Dean has been on working across these boundaries. I think all of the interesting problems that face the world today cross boundaries about business, government, civil society. And the topic for tonight is as good an example as there is. But throughout the conference going forward, we'll see one and another example. As many of you know, we're moving forward with a genuinely joint degree program with the business school, so it is a part of a much larger set of activities tonight. So I'm also very excited to be introducing Mark Mcclellan because he is an economist, and of course everyone loves economists. It's just everybody's favorite. But B, he's a graduate of the school, and we have a tradition at Harvard of taking complete credit for the good deeds of people that are graduates, and Mark has certainly done among the most. He is also a physician, and so among other things, he's the former commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, something that he'll be talking about tonight in terms of reform there. He's obviously held key roles as a practitioner, regulator, and analyst. He's currently the director of the Engelberg Center for Healthcare Reform and the Leonard D. Schaefer Chair in Health Policy Studies at Brookings. There he's working on issues of quality control, improving quality, eliminating excess costs, and very much focused on these private-public partnerships. He's also, one of the main reasons he remains in Washington is he remains quite active and energetically engaged in the public debates that are ongoing. And I think going forward, this is going to be a very important time in healthcare because it is a time when lots of people are talking about it. No one's quite faced up to the trade-offs that are involved, but if anyone can help us do that, it will be Mark Mcclellan. He's also an associate professor of economics at Harvard and economics and medicine at Stanford, He's also one of those rare folks that served both Republicans and Democratic administrations. He was a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the Treasury from 98 to 99. 2001 to 2002, he served as a member of the Council on Economic Advisors, and he advised on domestic issues. He also served during this time as Senior Policy Director for the healthcare and related issues in the White House. He then became the Administrator for the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. I also mentioned that he'd been the FDA Commissioner. So CMS is the agency that runs Medicare, Medicaid. It's got a very small budget, larger than nearly every country in the world. So in all these factors, one of the things that Mark Mcclellan has brought is enormous insight, ideas, and integrity. Indeed, he's also a two-time award winner for the Kenneth Arrow Award for the best paper in economics. There are very few people that win the best award for economics and then run the Food and Drug Administration or anything like it, and especially do it with distinction. We are very, very fortunate to have such a remarkable scholar, practitioner, and also role model in terms of public service as Mark Mcclellan tonight. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, David. David, thanks very much for that introduction. It is great to be back. You know, sitting here in the, up on the stage reminds me of all the forums that I used to attend. I see some students in the audience. It was a while ago now, but back then I was taking courses in some of the rooms around here, Dick Neustadt and Presidential Power. And by the way, since then I've learned that he was right. And I've had a chance to see the perspectives for the Kennedy School from the other side. I was talking with David before starting tonight about just how many different diverse pathways Kennedy School students end up taking in their careers. All of them seem to converge, though, on having a real impact on the well-being of people, the progress of nations, and improving public policy. So it's a real privilege for me to be back. And I'd also like to thank John Ruggie for his part in bringing this event together and being part of the Center for Business and Government on its anniversary with such strong support as the center has. It's a real privilege for me as well. The conference that this address is part of could not be more timely. Regulatory challenges are certainly changing in the issues that we face, but so are the opportunities available to solve problems where regulation might be used. We have more sophisticated, more complex systems to regulate as products and services have become much more tailored to the needs of individual consumers. We've got more regulatory tools available and more alternatives or supplements to regulation, including financial incentives and penalties, more sophisticated litigation strategies, richer information for consumers and producers to make effective decisions. And these kinds of trends are exemplified very well in healthcare, and that's what I want to talk about tonight. I want to focus my remarks on one key aspect of healthcare, and that's the challenges and the opportunities for new directions in the regulation of medical products. Our current regulatory systems haven't been working as well as we'd all like. Many of you are probably most familiar with the FDA over the last few years based on the bad news about the post-market regulation of drugs like Vioxx. This was a drug that was eventually removed from the market. It was a very widely used medicine for arthritis and other kinds of joint pains, a so-called COX-2 inhibitor, but it was removed finally after being on the market for more than 5 years, being used by millions of people. And since then, there have also been a lot of public outcries about other types of drugs, the use of antidepressants in children, the use of Avandia, a drug for diabetes. Many other drugs have made news about risks that at least some think have been larger than had been expected, at least for some kinds of patients. And I think the real frustration in the public with this isn't that drugs have risks as well as benefits when they're in actual use in the real world, or that some of these risks may not have become clear until well after a drug was on the market. That's always been true, but rather the public is understandably frustrated, I think, that we don't seem to be able to do a better job of following up and learning about these risks quickly and effectively, and of providing clear information to patients about which treatment is best for them. So there's been some real concerns about the post-market regulation at the FDA in the last few years. On top of that, the so-called pre-market regulatory system, the regulatory process that determines when a new medical product gets to the market, has also come under a lot of criticism. Now, at an agency like the FDA, you're never going to avoid criticism. In fact, one of the nice things I actually got used to after a while, going to my job every day, was that no matter what I did that day, no matter what decisions I made, I was going to get criticized. I was going to get criticized on both sides for going too fast or being too close to manufacturers or letting products on the market that might not be safe and effective enough. At the same time, criticisms for going too slow, for putting up bigger and bigger regulatory hurdles in the way of getting new cures to patients and perhaps adding to healthcare costs. So it's actually pretty refreshing when you go into work and know that no matter what you do, you're going to get criticized, but that means you can go forward with trying to focus on what you think is really best. Seriously, though, if you look at the outcomes of the pre-market regulatory process, there's some reasons to be concerned these days. We've seen a lot of increases over the past decade in research and development spending in biomedical technology. This includes a doubling of the National Institutes of Health public spending on research and development within the past decade. We've seen big increases in private spending on research and development. Pharmaceutical company, biotech company, medical device company spending on R&D is higher than ever before. Altogether, the sum total of this investment probably exceeds $100 billion a year. But at the same time, we're seeing what I think can only be described as low productivity in terms of translating this spending into new cures for patients. And this is very concerning in what is supposed to be an era of more personalized, effective, prevention-oriented medicine. It's an era that we haven't really reached yet. You've heard a lot about genomics, the sequencing of the human genome now about a decade ago. We've made some progress in turning our knowledge of how genes work into medical therapies, but the number of drugs like Herceptin that have been approved by the FDA based on specific knowledge of how it impacts people in relation to their genetic makeup, only a limited number of those kinds of drugs have actually been approved. New technologies like nanotechnology, small micro-sized devices that are supposed to be more effective and more targeted in being able to impact people's lives. One of the only nanotechnology products that's actually been approved by the FDA is Sunscreen. So there are only a limited number of products that have made it to actually influencing patient care, despite all of what you've read about in the papers about new types of biomedical breakthroughs, things like genomics, metabolomics, gene therapy. Very few products, if any products, available to treatments today, for patients today. Product success rates are low, and if anything, they're getting lower over time. Only about 20% of the drugs that ever make it into clinical testing are eventually approved by the FDA. And the failure rates, even in the large final trials before approval, the so-called phase 3 trials, exceed 50%. And it's not only uncertain, this investment in research and development, but it's also time-consuming and very expensive. Some of the latest estimates from here in Boston of the cost of developing a new drug put the present value of those expenses at $800 million to $1 billion or more, with a 10 to 15-year development time being typical. Overall, in recent years, the applications, the approvals of new drugs and biologics have been trending downward. They've been trending downward since the mid-1990s. There's a bit of a blip in the 2003-2004 period or so, but right now, only around 15 or so new drugs are being approved each year. Now, this isn't a perfect measure of productivity, but along with the slow translation of many of these new sciences into products that patients can actually use, it is very concerning from an innovation standpoint. Lots of investment, but not much to show for it. The era of more targeted, personalized medicines may be coming, but it's not coming quickly or cheaply. Now, some have said that the current regulatory process for demonstrating the safety and effectiveness of medical treatments may not even support where personalized medicine needs to go, towards more targeted therapies. Even if treatment is highly effective, if it's geared towards a specific subset of patients. So instead of treating a broad population of patients with a drug that's going to have a positive impact 20 or 30% of the time, maybe a narrow population of patients with a treatment that's going to be effective more like 80 or 90% of the time, be less likely to have side effects for that narrow population. Well, with this kind of framework for regulatory approval and the costs and the time involved, it may not support these kinds of therapies at all, these kinds of niche-based therapies. So we're at a time right now when we're kind of at a crossroads with new sciences coming along, potential for a new era of more personalized medicine, but regulatory structures that at least are raising real questions as to how well suited they are for bringing us into this next era of medical therapy. But I also think that we're at a time at the beginning of the FDA's second century, which is starting this year, when it may be possible to look back and say this was the beginning of a new kind of regulatory era, one in which we have regulation that encompasses a more science-based, efficient, critical path for bringing new drugs and other medical therapies to patients, especially those that are targeted to particular kinds of patients based on a solid understanding of the fundamental mechanisms of a disease and of the action of the medical treatment in that patient. And also regulation that develops much better evidence on the risks and benefits of medical products in actual use by building on an active system of routine post-market surveillance, better evidence that keeps getting better over time. Together, these kinds of regulatory reforms, which are possible now thanks to recently enacted legislation by Congress and to the potential for science to be applied to the regulatory process in new ways, these kinds of regulatory reforms can give the public significantly more confidence about the risks and benefits of the products they use while improving the efficiency of the medical innovation process. The result of this process could be much more productive R&D investment, much more productive than what we've been seeing in recent years, faster cures with a more efficient, targeted, life cycle approach to medical product development, which in turn can result in more effective medical treatments that we can use much more confidently and effectively, and it will keep getting better. So how do we get there from here? Well, I want to start by talking about the pre-market process, this regulatory process before a drug or a medical treatment comes to the market, comes to widespread use by patients. The current process, as I talked about a few minutes ago, generally takes a lot of time and a lot of investment, is very uncertain. Now, this isn't just a development problem. It's because treatments that are clearly effective do get approved by the FDA. It's more of a development problem, but one that I think regulatory expertise and innovative regulatory approaches can help provide the pathways to solve. And this is what the FDA's Critical Path Initiative is intended to address. It was a new initiative that was launched before I left FDA in 2004 about creating a better science-based pathway and the accompanying regulatory predictability to reduce the cost, reduce the time, to reduce the uncertainty of bringing new products to market and to help use them reliably. It is not a relaxation of FDA's standards of safety and effectiveness. It's rather a more science-based, efficient way to get to demonstrating safety and effectiveness. And it requires a new kind of collaboration between the public sector and academic leaders and the private sector and product developers themselves on improving the methods for demonstrating safety and effectiveness. Since this initiative was announced in 2004, the FDA has identified 76 what they call critical path opportunities that, if pursued, according to the FDA, would increase the predictability, efficiency, and productivity in the development of new medical products. There have also been some new public-private collaborations that have started around the country to take off on this kind of concept, including here at MIT's Center for Biomedical Innovation and also at other academic institutions like Duke. Collaborations between academic leaders, government experts, and private sector product developers. So this concept has gotten traction, and in fact, it's a major element of the new legislation that was just enacted by Congress in September. That legislation, the Fda Amendments Act, creates a new nonprofit FDA foundation called the Reagan-Udall Foundation to support FDA's critical path. This permits public-private collaboration and support, including in-kind contributions of data or expert scientists, as well as financial contributions to augment the FDA's limited resources, and a new fellowship program to build more technical capabilities at the agency itself. This initiative will be overseen by an independent, broadly based advisory board for the foundation that's about to be appointed sometime in the next couple of weeks to guide the new infrastructure to carry out this whole set of initiatives. So I want to be a little bit more concrete about what this means, because a lot of people think of the discovery process and the development process as about scientific breakthroughs in the lab. And while what I'm talking about is very scientifically driven, it's not that same kind of science. Rather, it's finding better ways, science-based ways, to demonstrate safety and effectiveness of products. So what might that include? Well, it might include better predictive tests for whether or not a particular patient is going to respond to a treatment or whether or not they'll have an important side effect. An early success in this area, an early success in this critical path initiative has been in genomics-based predictive testing for patient responses to a drug called Warfarin. This is a blood thinner that's very commonly used in the United States for people with heart problems or heart valve problems. What it does is help prevent blood clots, but it also has an important side effect of bleeding problems by making it more likely that you could have important bleeding problems, even as serious as strokes and the like. And there have been literally billions of dollars in extra healthcare costs associated, especially with patients who are starting these treatments anew, because they are either overtreated, meaning their blood gets thinned too much, so they have important bleeding complications, or undertreated, not thinned enough, and they have exactly the kinds of blood clotting complications that the treatment is designed to prevent. Well, by understanding the mechanism of action of this drug, there have been some genomically based tests developed to identify which patients are going to be more or less sensitive to the blood thinning process. And what this means is that there are now treatments available, now diagnostic tests available that can categorize patients into being very responsive or less responsive based on certain genetic features of their liver enzyme systems, the enzymes that process the drug involved in blood thinning. The result is expected to be some significant reductions in side effects associated with warfarin treatment and much better prediction of what kind of doses are needed for each patient to respond effectively to this therapy. So practically, what this is about is targeting treatments more effectively. In this case, it's a dosing targeting, but that can lead to significant savings from fewer side effects and getting to the right dose or the right treatment for a patient more quickly. Extending this same kind of idea means that we could do a better job of predicting which patients are going to respond to a targeted therapy. And that means lower costs of developing and then conducting the clinical trials necessary to demonstrate that a treatment really does have the intended effect, because you're much more likely to see a response if you can target the testing of the therapy more accurately. So a lot of potential here. There are many more examples of where this kind of data could be turned into knowledge. Just about every drug that's developed today is subjected to what's called microarray testing, where on a little slide it's possible to determine the response of different enzymes, different genes in the body to exposure to the drug. And so you can test responses to liver enzymes, like I was just describing, that might be involved in safety effects, oncogenes that may be involved in cancer expression, genes that may be involved in the actual response, the treatment benefit that a drug is supposed to provide. All of these are being done now by many of the different companies that are developing new medical therapies, and they look really good on the slides. You know, they turn green or red based on up or down regulation, but nobody yet knows what all of these data mean for predicting how a patient is going to respond to a medication. If we can do a better job of taking all this data and turning it into predictive experience, it'll be much easier to get to the era when we can develop, test, and make available targeted therapies that really work confidently in less time and at a lower cost. So that's one example of what I mean by developing the critical path science, this new kind of science-based regulatory pathway without compromising safety or effectiveness, actually learning better about which patients are most likely to respond and not have side effects with new therapies. Another example is adaptive trial designs. There is some innovative work going on in statistical methods for setting up clinical trials. As we do a better job of characterizing the different features of patients in a trial and the history of their illness, it's possible to design treatments or design studies to more accurately get conclusive information on the types of patients that are really responding to treatment. If this is specified in advance, it can help make the cost and the time for getting treatments approved significantly lower. Another example is what are called biomarkers. Now, these are indicators of patient responses to a treatment. Usually, for getting a new medical product approved, the FDA has to wait for evidence on impact on typically long-term or relatively long-term clinical outcomes. For example, whether or not a patient has a lower rate of death from a serious illness like stroke, if it's a treatment for high blood pressure. Well, because we validated a biomarker, an indicator of treatment response in this case, blood pressure itself, all you have to demonstrate to get a treatment approved for affecting stroke risk and the like is lowering blood pressure. You don't have to wait 2 or 3 or 5 years to show an impact on stroke mortality for patients who are taking the drug. Cholesterol is another example of this, and there's a blood test called hemoglobin A1C test for patients who have diabetes. It's another good indicator that can be observed in the relatively short term that predicts long-term clinical benefits for a patient. Unfortunately, we don't have these kinds of validated biomarkers for many kinds of diseases. An example of this is the case of Alzheimer's disease, where we really haven't worked out fully the mechanism by which the tangles appear in the neurons in the brain that are associated with the development of Alzheimer's symptoms, and we don't have any good predictors of patient response. There's some hope for indicators or biomarkers like impact in functional PET scans. There's now some very sophisticated imaging techniques that appear to show an impact for some drugs and appear to be different for patients who have progressed further in their Alzheimer's disease. But the studies haven't been done to relate the performance on these kinds of tests to the actual long-term clinical outcomes for patients. So to demonstrate a drug for Alzheimer's has a positive clinical benefit, you still have to do the longer-term clinical trial. And the result can be a very big difference in the time for getting safe and effective treatments to market. Perhaps the best example of this, of putting all of these scientific bases for showing that treatments are effective together and having an impact on making cures available more quickly, involves HIV and AIDS, where 25 years ago, this was a death sentence, but now we have a large number of treatments available that have transformed HIV into a chronic disease. We have solved all of these kinds of critical path problems, or really made significant progress on all the kinds of critical path problems that I've been talking about tonight in the case of this disease. We understand the disease mechanism, so we have some very good predictors of which patients are going to respond to particular kinds of treatments. We have good biomarkers available in the so-called viral load and the CD4 count for patients, so you don't have to do longer-term trials to show an impact on the rate of opportunistic infections or the survival rate of patients. We know that if we see a prolonged impact on viral load, that is going to translate into important clinical benefits. And as a result, the cost of trials, the success rate of trials, and the time for approval for new treatments for HIV/AIDS is much, much lower than that 10 to 15 year typical period that I talked about before. The average time for drug development and review for the currently available antiretrovirals has been under 4 years, and these treatments really work. Contrast that with Alzheimer's disease, where there's a tremendous amount of biomedical research going on, lots and lots of NIH investment, but very few effective therapies available, many in process, but many unproven. And you can see the difference that improving the scientific process of product development and developing clear regulatory pathways based on this science can make in terms of getting cures available to patients more quickly and reliably and at a lower cost. So with new regulatory authority and with public-private support, it is time for some major collaborative efforts to solve these sorts of problems. And I think of it as analogous in many ways to what happened with the semiconductor industry in the United States in the late 70s and early 1980s, where the productivity of the industry had been going down and there were some real concerns about its future viability in the United States. This led to the launch of a public-private collaboration called SEMATech, focusing on increasing the productivity of the semiconductor industry. And according to the MIT Center for Biomedical Innovation, what that public-private collaboration found was that the vast majority of the steps that needed to be taken to increase productivity were actually pre-competitive in nature, were things that all the different competing firms could take advantage of and still differentiate their products, still have a viable market for their own products. Many steps here, similarly, are about things like validating biomarkers, determining more accurate predictors of patient responses, improving the efficiency of clinical trials. All of those things are in that category. They're not going to benefit just one company. In fact, unless the FDA has a hard science basis for taking these steps, they can't even exist at all. They're going to change the way that product development can work to hopefully improve competition and improve innovation among all the product development companies in these areas. So unless the FDA and the many innovators who are developing products find ways to turn all the data that they're generating related to these kinds of innovation issues into well-founded, scientifically grounded evidence, which is only going to happen soon if there is a pre-competitive, neutral, scientific way to share the experience, we're not going to see all of these new sciences like genomics translating into proven effective treatments for patients, having an actual impact on the care of people in this country anytime soon. Now, these are not glamorous steps. These are not the traditional Nobel Prize-winning breakthroughs in the lab that you read about in the papers, but they can make all the difference between whether medical innovation is meaningful for people or not. The critical path can be the difference between reading about a possible cure in the paper that may come along someday and having a treatment available that you or someone you care about can use with confidence that is going to improve their health. Now, the opportunity for new regulatory approaches based on more complete data and better science also applies to the post-market setting for regulating medical products. So after they've been determined to be safe and effective by the FDA and after they're on the market, there's still a lot more we can do through innovative regulation. The usual FDA debate here is between and came up very much in this legislative process earlier this year when Congress was debating what steps to take to improve the post-market regulatory system. The usual debate was between, well, you can't trust the drug companies. We need to impose more significant regulation to address those kinds of post-market issues that I talked about earlier in my remarks, versus if you do that, you're going to reduce access to new treatments. This is sort of the usual FDA kind of debate. But the effort to reform the FDA's post-market regulatory system in legislation this year ended up being a very strongly bipartisan effort. It passed Congress with a strong bipartisan vote, over 90% of the House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats voting together to support the reform effort. So who says bipartisanship isn't possible in healthcare? And the President signed this bill into law in late September. It was due to the leadership of people like Senator Kennedy and Senator Enzi, the chairman and ranking member of the Senate Health Committee that oversees the FDA, as well as bipartisan involvement of leaders in the House and many other Senate members as well. But one reason it passed with such a strong bipartisan margin is that it got out of that usual FDA debate. The new law does give the FDA a lot more and more explicit post-market regulatory authority for regulating drugs that are already on the market. The FDA now has more explicit authority to compel clinical studies, to require label changes if it deems them appropriate, to restrict the marketing and use of a drug, to impose monetary penalties when companies don't comply with its regulatory guidance. But very importantly, in the final legislation doesn't require all of these new kinds of regulatory steps across the board. Instead, the legislation envisions first developing more definitive evidence about drug risks and benefits, using more comprehensive and better data based on the actual experience of using the drug in the population. Currently, to detect safety signals for drugs that are on the market, the FDA relies primarily on what are called spontaneous adverse event reports from manufacturers to the agency and from patients as well to the agency itself. And the FDA gets hundreds of thousands of these adverse event reports a year, and the numbers are going up. But because it's a system that's not automatic, the vast majority of adverse events involving drugs in this country are not captured. Either health professionals are too busy, or events like heart problems in patients with heart disease, which was the case with Vioxx, aren't something that many people would think to report to the FDA. And the data can be hard to interpret because it's based on individual reports. It's not based on a population experience with a drug. So instead, the new law takes a fundamentally new tack. It recognizes that it's time for a different approach, a population-based system of active post-market surveillance to follow up on suspected safety problems that might be identified at the time that a drug comes to market or might be suspected based on later experience but can't be definitively proved until there is this actual experience with using a drug in real-world settings. Thanks to progress with electronic health data, this kind of system is increasingly feasible. Virtually all prescriptions today in this country are handled electronically, and information on prescriptions can be linked to important information from private insurance plans, from Medicare, from the VA health system on complications and other outcomes for patients. So the law envisions getting to a public-private collaborative system that might incorporate these sorts of data, not patient-identifiable data, but summary data on the experiences of whole populations of patients, millions of patients, from these kinds of electronic data sources. The law envisions getting to a routine surveillance system, an active surveillance system for new drugs that are on the market and for following up on suspected problems with existing drugs that might, in a few years, include more than 100 million Americans. And according to simulations by Dr. Richard Platt, a physician at Harvard who is an expert on these issues, with this larger routine monitoring and follow-up of suspected drug safety problems, the higher rate of adverse cardiovascular events with Vioxx could have been detected in just a few months, not 5 years. And this would permit much more quick and more effective regulatory action. So prescription information can increasingly be linked through a population-based approach to understanding risks and benefits more comprehensively in actual medical treatment and creating better medical evidence about those products in the process. Now, of course, while there's a lot that can be learned to improve evidence on drug risks and benefits from the routine and effective use of population-based surveillance, there are some questions that aren't going to be answered definitively by these kinds of methods. These large population data sets are what the statistical experts call observational data sets. They don't provide the same evidence on causality, a drug causing a problem, as a randomized clinical trial might. It may be the case that higher rates of adverse events are occurring in patients that use a certain medicine just because the patients are different in ways that are hard to measure. So not all questions are going to be answered, but even in these cases, having better population data, fundamentally better population evidence, is going to help target follow-up clinical studies that might be needed, so that when the FDA does use its increased regulatory powers in the post-market setting, we can be more confident that we're going to get something out of it, that we're going to get to a more definitive answer, hopefully more efficiently, because again, it's going to be targeted more effectively to the population where there is a potential risk, because we've been able to define that much more clearly using these large population databases. So all this together means more efficient information on the risks and benefits of medical products to guide further regulatory actions. Now, because of the focus on better evidence and not just more of the same regulation, this approach got broad support in the legislation. And because it relies less on product manufacturers, who are increasingly facing an environment where the evidence on their product's safety and effectiveness is being developed by others, developed under circumstances beyond their direct control, it got support from people who didn't have a whole lot of trust in the pharmaceutical and manufacturing and medical product manufacturing industry. Got support across the board, better evidence, and developed through independent collaborative sources. So now the challenge facing the FDA is how to implement this new approach effectively, and it's going to be a big change. It provides an opportunity to create a much more comprehensive approach to learning about the actual use of drugs in our population, about the risks and the benefits, maybe at the level of more specific subgroups of patients after a new treatment has reached the market. For the first time, we've got the potential for a timely and reliable monitoring system for rare side effects that should never happen, or side effects that are suspected in actual use but can't be proven in the pre-market setting of clinical trials that can't mimic all the real-world conditions and patient circumstances that inevitably arise, and a new opportunity for learning about the use and the possibly positive impacts of drugs and other medical therapies in specific subgroups of patients that may respond differently, all very hard to study in the pre-market setting. With these steps, the public can have much more confidence that just because a drug gets to market, it won't be many years before we get to more definitive evidence about risks and benefits. So thanks to this combination of new scientific and regulatory opportunities, with this new legislation, it's possible to get to a better use of medical products based on much better evidence. Now, as with any major legislation, there's something that everybody doesn't like in it. There's some way it could have been better. I have some concerns about some of the liability provisions in the new FDA law, for example. And also, as always, how the law is implemented is going to be extremely important. There are many new authorities, and there are going to be many challenges, and the FDA is using them effectively. The FDA remains woefully short of the funding that it needs to carry out all of these responsibilities, as well as many other critical functions like the safety of foods and food imports. But all of these problems and challenges notwithstanding, it really is potentially the dawn of a new regulatory era. There is an opportunity for significantly faster and greater biomedical progress with greater public confidence, thanks to more effective regulation driven by better science, something that we desperately need to take advantage of where biomedical science is actually taking us. Put together, this whole approach on the pre-market side and the post-market side, the whole potential for regulatory reform is to get us up to and more in line with the health care that should be generating more targeted, more personalized, more prevention-oriented treatments in the 21st century. This is much more of a life cycle approach to medical product development, to more targeted therapies. It can drive the kind of innovation that we have the potential for achieving in the 21st century, but that we really have not achieved yet. That means a more targeted and efficient pathway for the initial approval of new drugs and medical products using those critical path methods that I talked about before. The FDA does something like this now for what are called orphan drugs, drugs that are intended to be targeted to very rare diseases. So you could see an initial approval around a particular narrow group of patients where we are very confident based on the disease mechanism and predictors of patient response and biomarkers that the treatment is going to be very effective. But then that's not the end of the line. There will be a continuing process after a drug is on the market or after a medical product is on the market for learning more about risks and benefits in that population and in many other types of patient populations. It's a cheaper way of getting to market, and it's a recognition that drugs and other medical products are going to continue to have more and more evidence developed that can help us use them more effectively over time. This more targeted, science-based, data-intensive approach, I think, is much better suited to the promise of 21st century medicine than what we've had in the past. In fact, I think if we don't take these regulatory steps, we may not ever see that promise of personalized, targeted medicine fulfilled. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. As is our normal style, we have time now for questions. There are 4 microphones located in the audience. One is right over here, one is up there, one is up there, and the final one is right here. And we'll just rotate through. Now, those of you that have come here before will know what comes next, but there are some ground rules. And that is, good questions have several features. First, they start by your identifying yourself. Second, they are short and contain only one thought. And third, they end with a question mark. So with that, let me start right over here.
Hi, Keith Batchelder, Genomic Healthcare Strategies. I'm going to break your rule. I'm going to make a comment and then a question. I applaud I applaud the initiatives you talk about. I think that initiatives like CPATH are going to help make transparent and better understandable both the scientific and monetary risk of developing products. So I think that's going to stimulate investment by both companies and private equity investors. On the other hand, I think that a lot of these things don't work in a vacuum. And one of the issues that I see facing personalized medicine is a reimbursement strategy that compensates those people that develop biomarkers and diagnostics. In the past, we've heard talk about the FDA and CMS working together. Do you see that as a potential as you move forward, and how would that play out?
Good question, and let me put my CMS hat on for a minute. By the way, I talk about FDA and regulatory issues tonight, but if you have questions on other things, feel free to to ask about them. The reimbursement systems that Medicare uses in the traditional Medicare program are largely fee-for-service based, which means that you get paid a certain amount. It's usually based on the cost of a treatment rather than its value. And as we move to this era of more personalized therapies that are more effective, that's going to need to change. The typical way of keeping costs down in the Medicare program is to squeeze down on the prices and to restrict access to treatments. But where medicine ought to be headed is towards treatments that, when they're used, are really more valuable, more likely to have a positive impact on the individual patients who are using them, and are probably going to be more sophisticated in the rules or the clinical guidance that might need to be used to implement them. Combinations of therapies may turn out to be important, and that is going to be increasingly hard to capture in the kind of regulatory restrictions that CMS or a private managed care plan might try to impose on how a treatment is used. So I think we need to make progress at the same time as we're focusing on scientific breakthroughs in the regulatory process towards proving that treatments are safe and effective, and hopefully even more effective in certain patients, to move reimbursement towards more of a focus on value of technologies as well. There are a lot of efforts underway now to support reforms in payments by Medicare and private health plans that would be based not on a specific fee schedule for the use of certain treatments, but based more on the results or the clinical impact of the treatments provided on a patient's health. And this is also starting to come to payments and pricing for medical therapies. Some drug manufacturers are moving towards more outcomes-based pricing, where the payment that they receive is contingent, at least in part, on the impact that the treatment has on a patient's health. That also would reinforce your main point, which is that we need to put more of a focus on what these technologies are contributing to patient health and what resources are involved in producing them. So we need to move away, just as we're moving away in the regulatory process from some of these traditional approaches. We need to move away from paying just based on volume and intensity and paying more based on the impact of a treatment on patient health. And I'm optimistic. It's going to be challenging, but I'm optimistic that we can keep making progress on that too.
Right over here.
Hi, my name is Ali Lockman, and I am a sophomore at the college. And my question moves a little ways away from what you talked about tonight and more towards your time as commissioner at the FDA. And okay, so while you were in the FDA, the Plan B drug applied for OTC status, and I realized that it wasn't your administration that made the final decision on it, I believe. But if you had to make that decision, what would you have decided and why?
Well, it's a good question. I wasn't there for the final decisions, as you mentioned, and that was an issue where there were a number of briefings, including some that I had, that were about what is the status of the quality evidence on safety and effectiveness of the treatment, particularly in a set of patients who had not had access to this before because it was over the counter, whether there was a learned intermediary involved, whether that would make a difference. This is another case where I think better evidence could really help guide the decisions. Plan B has been over the counter in a number of states for a number of years, but one thing that we didn't have very much access to while I was at FDA was some definitive studies or definitive analysis based on patient experience with the treatment on safety-related issues. The evidence, particularly in teens, was much more limited. And I think that's why the agency ended up concluding that it was safe and effective for use in adults, but they wanted to see more evidence on effects in teenagers before it could become over-the-counter there as well. So I wasn't there for that part of the decision, but you can hopefully see what the agency's decision process was.
Next, right up here.
Miranda Daniloff-Mancusi, I'm with the Center for Business and Government here at the Kennedy School. Thank you very much for being here tonight. We've got this globalization thing going on, and I am wondering whether you can comment on the benefits and the negatives of that. You read these stories about how your medical tests are being read overseas, shipped overseas and being read overseas. You also hear these stories about how drug companies are also outsourcing their clinical trials to countries where the regulatory regimes are slightly less stringent. So I'm wondering if you could comment on the globalization aspect of this.
Well, I think definitely some of that is going on, both in the development of new treatments, developing evidence and studies performed overseas, and in actually providing medical treatments with growth in medical tourism. Now, it's still a very small fraction of overall healthcare use, at least medical tourism is. And on net, there's a lot of the treatment that takes place here where people come from abroad because they have access to care care that they think is of higher quality and is going to have a bigger impact, especially if they've got very severe illnesses. But I think more of that is coming. My hope is that it would be driven as well by good evidence on what works. And the FDA is in the process of reviewing its standards for overseeing clinical trials and trying to make sure that as more of these trials may be performed, or at least components of them may be performed overseas, there's confidence that they're being performed with appropriate standards and the like. But I think that is a fundamental trend in healthcare. You know, people used to say that all healthcare is local, and that's definitely not true anymore.
Right here.
Hi, my name is Ilan Alon, and I'm a professor of international business from Rollins College and a fellow at the center. I enjoyed your talk today. It was very informative as a non-specialist to learn about the technology and the law and how these two things are dovetailing. What you didn't touch base on, which I have a question, is the cultural and ethical dimensions. In particular, there's been a lot of discussion on the stem cell research, the ethical dimension of stem cell research. And to what extent are we losing our global competitive edge as a result of adhering to some other standards that may not be the same in other countries?
There has obviously been a lot of debate around that, and stem cells is another example of one of these technologies. You know, I mentioned gene therapy, nanotechnology, even genomics, where you read a lot about it in the press, but the actual applications to patient care are still almost non-existent. With stem cell technologies, there's certainly a lot of technical issues that have to be overcome, and certainly some arguments to be made that if there were no restrictions on the use of stem cell lines, that those could be overcome more quickly. But I think from the standpoint of my remarks tonight, what probably is worth focusing on is whether there are ways to solve some of the issues related to demonstrating the effectiveness of stem cell technologies, whether there are technologies that are derived from cord blood in accordance with current federal reimbursement policies or not. There still are a whole host of issues about demonstrating safety and effectiveness, and especially avoiding risks and side effects in patients that have not been well specified. And I think there have been several reports, the NIH, identifying some of these practical challenges in bringing stem cell technologies to patients. So regardless of your views on the ethics of using different lines of stem cells, the fact remains that any stem cell line is going to continues to face a lot of obstacles in demonstrating safety and safe and effective, reliable use. So we're still years away from stem cell technologies, and an emphasis on the kinds of critical path approaches that I talked about tonight could really help hasten that process along.
Right over here.
Hi, Ben Zeskind. I'm a student at Harvard Business School and also a PhD from MIT. My question is, you talked about the urgent need for validated biomarkers, and I certainly agree with you on that. And there are some kind of scientific hurdles to getting there. Yeah. But as I look at the literature, there's a lot of molecules out there that have potential as biomarkers. And so my sense is that the challenges are not all entirely scientific. And I'm sort of curious about what your sense is of what other challenges are keeping us from having validated biomarkers. You know, is it lack of financial incentives? Are there regulatory challenges? Yeah. What besides the science itself is sort of holding us back?
But all that goes together. I mean, there are a lot of potential candidate markers where, you know, one or another lab study or small clinical study has shown an association between the course of a disease and the performance of this marker. And as we've got more and more potential markers to look at, I mean, think about the explosion in imaging technologies, the explosion in metabolomics and genomic testing. You know, I mentioned microarray testing. There's potentially an unlimited array of these markers. There isn't a coherent science for putting all these together and helping us prioritize which ones might be the most important to look at first. And I think the kinds of public-private collaborative processes between industry experts who have their own experiences with their own particular areas of product development, their own particular products, academic experts who are often publishing some of these studies suggesting an association, and the FDA, which can give you a good, healthy dose of broad-based experience and skepticism that some of these theories may actually play out in practice, that will hopefully help us identify the priority ones to do the follow-up testing on. You can, the mechanisms for validating a biomarker are not easy, but it's fairly easy to see what kind of scientific studies are necessary to follow through on a large enough population to determine the sort of key steps of a causal process in the disease and a clear association, strong and significant association with the patient results. We know how to do that science. It's just a matter of getting together and carrying it out. And that requires funding. It also requires collaboration because different product developers each have their own experience with some of these potential biomarkers. And until we pool that experience, which we can do with help from the FDA as well, since they get to see these experiences across a lot of different product developers, until we take those steps, we're not going to solve these problems. It's all going to be potential, just like it is today. It makes for a lot of good journal articles, but it doesn't translate into an actual impact on demonstrating that treatments are safe and effective and can be used reliably in patients. Thanks.
Right over here.
Thank you. Are we allowed 2 questions among your...
It depends on your name. If you give your name first, I think the answer will be yes.
Sharmeen Mosavar-Rahmani from Goldman Sachs. You mentioned that even though there's been tremendous R&D investment, whether it's public or private sector, there has been a big decrease in productivity.
Yeah.
Are you attributing all of that decrease to the regulatory issues you raised,
No,
or is there just diminishing returns to the medical research?
It's a very good question. I don't think it's all due to the regulatory process. I think it's due to a combination of a regulatory process that has had, in many cases, fairly similar standards for demonstrating safety and effectiveness for a number of decades, combined with the fact that the kinds of products being developed today, where all this research is taking place, aren't the same kind that led to those higher rates of productivity in the blockbuster drugs of the 1990s. These are treatments that are typically more targeted, that are more based on understanding of disease mechanisms, that may have a smaller population of patients involved, and that may be more complex molecules with more potential for side effects. So as the FDA does what it requires in terms of demonstrating safety and effectiveness, you get into a challenge of needing larger populations to study a treatment and not necessarily being able to target those very well. I don't think, and I want to be very clear about this is not just an issue of regulatory standards becoming stricter. It's an issue of the science behind product development not matching up well with the science of demonstrating that treatments are safe and effective. We maybe had a better match back in the 1990s. And today, with I think what the low rates of product success shows you, and most of these products are abandoned before they ever get to the FDA, is that we aren't doing a very good job of predicting which treatments are really going to be effective and not have important side effects for patients. And until we do a better job of that, I don't think we're going to see this productivity decline reverse. You said you had a second question, right?
The second question was, you made a brief reference to Alzheimer's and there being some things out there. Do you actually think that anything will be resolved on the Alzheimer's side?
Well, I hope so. I mean, it certainly is a huge economic burden and a huge public health burden where we really haven't seen, despite all the investment, and it's literally, tens of $billions a year going in with hundreds of compounds for Alzheimer's treatment and development, very little to show for it. I mean, there are a few drugs on the market that might influence the progression of early-stage Alzheimer's a little bit, but not too much. And it's hard to make any definitive conclusions about this disease because there are not an unlimited number of diseases out there to compare to. But if you contrast Alzheimer's with something like HIV/AIDS, every step of the way, we've solved problems in the development process for HIV that we haven't solved for Alzheimer's disease. We understand the disease mechanism at the molecular level for HIV quite well. We understand how the virus works. We understand the different sites that a drug might modify the activity of the virus. We don't really even have a good understanding in the case of Alzheimer's of what the pathogenesis of the disease really is. We know it's associated with these neurofibrillary tangles and clumps in neurons, but is that a consequence of a disease process? Is it a cause of the underlying pathophysiology? That's not even clear. We don't have any good predictors of which patients are going to respond to treatments. There have been, in contrast, for HIV, there's recently a new drug approved that was based on a particular particular genomic profile in the patients who would be using it. And we don't have any good biomarkers. We have to do the sort of the long-term studies of early stage Alzheimer's impact of actually following patients over a number of years to see if they have a measurable clinical decline in their cognitive function. While there have been a lot of proposed biomarkers, kind of getting back to the earlier question, like functional PET scans, which do show changes in activity in different areas of the brain for people who appear to go on to develop Alzheimer's symptoms and the classic conditions that meet a definition of Alzheimer's disease. We haven't yet proven that those markers are in fact valid predictors of whether or not a patient is responding or not. And so, that means years more time for demonstrating that an Alzheimer's treatment is effective or not. Until we solve these kinds of scientific problems in the development process for Alzheimer's, in much the same way that we've solved them for HIV and some of the other conditions, I don't think we're going to see a big increase in the productivity and the return to the disease, which I think leads to the natural conclusion that it would be worth investing a fraction of what we're investing in the basic science of Alzheimer's disease in these kinds of steps to improve the science of product development for Alzheimer's. I think it's a prime candidate for the kinds of critical path steps that I talked about in my remarks.
Thank you.
Right here.
Hello, my name is Debbie. I'm a student at the college. And you've spoken so much about the post-market testing, which is very timely considering the incidence of Vioxx and the antidepressants in youth. But my question to you is, what do you consider to be the implications of the increased surveillance on the patient, the consumer's privacy?
Very good question, Debbie, about privacy impacts. And, we're not going to this has been a big issue, and we're talking about drug safety and risks and benefits of medical technologies tonight, but whether it's that or understanding quality of care better generally or getting to personalized electronic health records, none of that is going to happen until we have protections in place that the public really believes are going to keep their confidential and private information confidential and private. And there's been a lot of work done in recent years to try to define what that could be. In doing some of the background work for this legislation, there was a lot of emphasis on determining whether it would be possible to do this population-based surveillance without relying on individual level data in any new ways at all. What do I mean by that? Well, right now there's data on a population basis available or present in many different sources, maybe from particular health plans, maybe from Medicare, maybe from a VA hospital and the like. If we're interested in a particular drug safety question, like whether or not a new drug is associated with a higher rate of adverse liver function, it's possible to envision a system whereby the FDA would say, look, we want estimates of the rate of these kinds of adverse events occurring in patients that have certain clinical characteristics and are taking a drug, and that gets sent out to all the different components of our healthcare system where private confidential data already is being used. And at that level, at the local level, those calculations are made so that what ends up getting shared back to the FDA isn't that Mrs. Smith in health plan X was taking Vioxx and had an adverse event, but rather our health plan had 26,000 patients on Vioxx and 12 of them had a particular adverse event occur. So what's reported is the rate. And if everyone is following the same basic methods, and if there's a way for auditing that and verifying that, you don't actually have to share any confidential information in a new way. And this is, I think, a philosophy that's behind a lot of the efforts to create a more confident system for using electronic data based on what might be called a distributed data network. You don't create a big warehouse somewhere, not at FDA or anywhere else, that's got all kinds of identifiable patient information for 100 million Americans. Rather, you keep that distributed in the current system, but because we have sort of common interoperable rules that each component of our electronic healthcare system is following, we can still learn about the relevant information we need, the so-called summary statistics, without sharing confidential information in a new way. And that kind of philosophy was behind some of the ideas in this public-private partnership partnership for developing an active surveillance system. Some of the same kinds of ideas are being developed now for biosurveillance, for potential adverse events or public health outbreaks as well. You don't need to share the identifiable information. You just need to have some common rules in place that permit calculating the summary statistics, the means or the population rates that can help answer the underlying questions.
Thank you.
I'm afraid we only have time for one more question. I guess, Alison, you were here first.
Alison Taunton-Rigby, I'm CEO of a biotech company, Ribonovics. I totally agree with your comments about genomics and personalized medicine, but for the biotech and the pharmaceutical industry, there's a significant ramification, and that's the economics of the market size.
Yeah.
You're turning every disease into a much smaller, very targeted, very special, but the economics
With much more effective treatments.
Yeah, much more effective, but how are you going to deal with the economics of what it's going to do to the
Well,
cost
that
of
gets back to
drugs?
the earlier question, which I think not coincidentally was also asked by someone from the biotech industry on how is reimbursement going to work. And let me just reiterate that I don't think that traditional fee-for-service type healthcare reimbursement methods capture this very well, where the way that to bigger revenues is to increase market share rather than to target treatments to patients that are really going to benefit. We need to take some more steps in our reimbursement systems to focus on value and on the impact of medical therapies. The good news for the biotech industry, I think, is that unless we solve these problems, it affects a lot more people and groups than just yours. In Medicare today, for example, physicians are facing a 10% reduction in their payment rates next year by the operation of a statutory formula that basically just says, look, we can't afford to pay the physicians anymore. Their volume and intensity of services went up by more than the growth of our GDP, our gross domestic product. And so to account for that, we're just going to reduce payment rates across the board. Well, that's obviously not a sustainable system, not from the standpoint of paying physicians, not from the standpoint of promoting quality care. And there are so many examples of where our healthcare system currently falls short in delivering quality, overuse of treatments, underuse of treatments, misuse of treatments, that there is going to be an increasing amount of pressure to change away from this volume-based reimbursement system to a system that does a better job of recognizing when healthcare providers and healthcare providers working together are doing a better job of having an impact on a patient's health. That, in turn, is going to help support innovation in truly valuable medical technologies, truly valuable biomedical products. And I think it's very important for the biotech industry to recognize that that's the way forward, not to try to keep somehow the current reimbursement system in place or to somehow try to edge up some of their regulated payments, but to recognize that we need to move towards a system where there's more flexibility in how medical technologies are used and how the prices are set, but it is much more related to value, to impact on outcomes and impacts on overall cost of care.
I hate to say it, but the American system is the higher the value, the higher the price. I mean,
right, but that and if there is good evidence to back that up, then we can still get to higher value in healthcare, avoiding unnecessary costs. Many of these new biotech treatments help avoid important complications of diseases, and in the case of Alzheimer's, we were talking about earlier, may even help save some healthcare costs. If those benefits can be clearly documented, and the kinds of steps I've been talking about tonight should help make that possible at a lower cost, then you've got a better foundation for setting up reimbursement systems. If we can come up with biomarkers to indicate which treatments are having an effect, the safety and effectiveness of treatments, you can even envision biomarkers playing a bigger role in reimbursement systems. In Medicare over the last few years, we implemented some demonstration programs, not nationally, but with some medical group practices and some collaborations across regional areas where Medicare is paying more, not when diabetic patients get more services, but when their hemoglobin A1C levels are under better control. And overall, Medicare costs are held down because of fewer complications. So there is a pathway towards using these same kinds of steps to promote better support for reimbursement of truly valuable new technologies, just as there is a pathway for better support for demonstrating that they're safe and effective.
Mark, thank you very much. High value for low cost. It's terrific.
Thank you all very much.
So those of you that are joining us for dinner, registered for the conference and so forth, the buses are up at the top of the hill back that way. We think? Yes. Okay, so just go out this door, up the hill, and you'll find the buses. Thanks very much.